"You're making a mistake," Naomi Brooks said, and the words landed louder than the sirens outside, slicing through the low hum of late-night conversations in the diner as every head slowly turned toward the door, where two officers stood with firm posture and cold certainty, their presence flooding the small room with flashing red and blue reflections that danced across chrome surfaces and half-finished plates. Ethan Caldwell stood between them, tall, composed, wrists loosely held, not resisting, not explaining, just watching, as if the entire moment was a calculation he had already solved. But Naomi didn't see a criminal. She saw the man who 10 minutes earlier had quietly paid for a struggling mother's meal 2 booths over without asking for thanks. The man who had spoken softly, who had looked people in the eye in a room where most didn't bother, and something about that didn't match what was happening now. "Ma'am, step aside," one officer said, voice controlled, practiced, but Naomi didn't move, her tray still in her hand, her heartbeat loud in her ears, because this wasn't just about a stranger. This was about a feeling she knew too well, the feeling that truth could be decided by who had the loudest voice in the room. And she had promised herself a long time ago she wouldn't stay silent when something felt wrong. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a brief shadow across her face as she set the tray down slowly, deliberately, her fingers steady even if everything inside her wasn't. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a blade of clarity. And for a split second the entire diner seemed to pause, forks hovering midair, conversations dissolving into silence, even the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter fading into the background. The officer blinked, not expecting resistance from someone in an apron, not expecting a question, especially not from her, and Ethan's gaze shifted, just slightly, something unreadable passing through his eyes as he studied Naomi like she had just stepped into a story he hadn't planned. "This doesn't concern you," the officer replied, but Naomi took one small step forward anyway, closing the space, not aggressively, not recklessly, just enough to make it clear she wasn't leaving. "Then arrest me too," she said, and the words didn't rise, they settled, heavy, undeniable, anchoring themselves. In the center of the room as phones quietly lifted, recording, capturing, waiting, a murmur rippled through the crowd, uncertainty creeping in where certainty had just been. And then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan exhaled, a faint shift, before speaking for the first time, his voice low, controlled, a single sentence that no one fully understood but somehow changed everything. Because moments later the officers exchanged a glance, tension loosening, their grip easing, and without explanation they stepped back, leaving behind confusion, whispers, and a silence that felt heavier than the noise before. Naomi stood there, breath catching up to her courage, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of who she had just defended, but certain of one thing. This story wasn't over, not even close. The silence did not leave when the officers did. It lingered like smoke in the air, thick and uncomfortable, curling around every table and every whispered thought as Naomi slowly reached for the tray she had set down, her fingers brushing the cool metal like she needed something solid to remind herself this was real, because nothing about the last 2 minutes made sense, not the way the police backed off without explanation, not the way the room had turned from judgment to curiosity, and definitely not the way Ethan Caldwell was still standing there, calm, composed, as if the storm had never touched him. Conversations did not return all at once. They crept back in pieces, low murmurs, cautious glances, the kind of quiet that comes after something important happens, but no one knows how to name it yet. And Naomi could feel the weight of eyes on her, not the dismissive look she was used to, but something different, something sharper, like people were trying to figure out who she was now. Her manager rushed over, his voice tight, forced into a whisper that carried more panic than authority, asking what she thought she was doing, reminding her that customers like that did not need complications. But Naomi barely heard him because her attention was fixed on Ethan, who had not moved, who had not rushed to leave, who simply adjusted his cuff with a slow, deliberate motion before turning toward her. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice even, not loud, but somehow cutting through everything else. And Naomi swallowed, unsure whether she had just helped him or made a mistake that would cost her job, her stability, everything she had worked to keep steady. But she held his gaze anyway, because backing down now would undo everything she had just stood for. "I know," she replied, her voice softer than before, but no less certain. And for a brief second something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, not gratitude exactly, but recognition. Like he had just found something unexpected in a place he never thought to look. Outside, the flashing lights were gone, replaced by the steady glow of street lamps reflecting off rain-slick pavement. And the diner felt smaller somehow, like the walls had moved closer to contain what had just happened. And then Ethan reached into his pocket, not for money, not for a card, but for his phone, glancing at it briefly before slipping it back without a word. A small action that seemed meaningless to everyone else, but somehow carried weight Naomi could not explain. He stepped closer to the counter, leaving a bill far larger than the cost of his meal. But he did not make a show of it, did not wait for thanks, did not even look at it again. Instead his eyes returned to Naomi, steady, measuring, as if memorizing her face, her voice, the moment she chose to stand when everyone else stayed seated. "Be careful," he said quietly, and it was not a warning, not a threat, but something in between. Something that suggested he understood consequences in a way she did not yet. And then just like that he turned and walked out into the night, the door chiming softly behind him, leaving Naomi standing in the center of a room that no longer felt ordinary, her heart still racing, her thoughts catching up in fragments, because deep down she knew this was not over, not even close, and whatever power had just shifted in that moment was already moving towards something she could not yet see. The door had barely stopped swinging when the noise returned, louder this time, sharper, filled with questions no one wanted to ask out loud, as Naomi moved on instinct, picking up plates, wiping counters, doing anything to keep her hands busy, because stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying every second of what just happened. The way the officers looked at Ethan before they stepped back, the way his voice carried weight without raising volume, the way he said be careful like he already knew something she did not. "Naomi," her manager called again, this time not whispering, his tone clipped, strained, pulling her back into the reality of her job, her paycheck, her place in a system that did not reward disruption, and she nodded quickly, apologizing, even though she did not feel sorry, not really, just aware that choices had consequences, and hers were already circling closer than she could see. The rest of the night passed in fragments, orders called out, coffee poured, receipts printed, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every small sound amplified, every glance lingering a second too long, as if the diner itself had shifted into a different version of itself, where something unseen was already in motion. By the time her shift ended, the sky outside had turned that pale gray blue just before sunrise, the kind that made everything look softer than it was, and Naomi stepped out into the cool air, wrapping her jacket tighter around her as the city stretched awake around her, delivery trucks rumbling by, streetlights flickering off one by one. And for a moment, she let herself breathe, convincing herself that whatever that moment had been inside, it was over now. Just another strange night in a job full of them. But the next morning did not arrive quietly. It arrived with the low, synchronized hum of engines, deep and controlled, the kind of sound that did not belong on a narrow street lined with small businesses and aging brick. And Naomi noticed it before she even reached the diner, her steps slowing as sleek black vehicles came into view, parked in a perfect line like they had been placed there with intention rather than convenience, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning light in sharp, deliberate angles. People were already gathering, neighbors, early customers. Even the owner of the laundromat next door standing outside with his arms crossed, watching, like something important was about to unfold. And Naomi felt it then, that same quiet shift in the air from the night before, the same feeling that something larger than her understanding was moving into place. As she pushed the door open, the bell chiming above her head, the diner was not the same. The usual morning rush replaced by stillness, by men in tailored suits standing near the counter, their presence calm but undeniable, like they did not need to speak to be in control of the room. And her manager stood behind the register, pale, rigid, holding a folder he had not opened yet, his eyes locking onto Naomi the second she stepped inside, as if she was the answer to a question he had not asked out loud. And then one of the men turned toward her, his expression professional, measured, and said her name with certainty, not asking, not guessing, just knowing. Naomi Brooks, he said, and the way he spoke it made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if everything that had happened last night had followed her here and was now standing right in front of her, waiting. Naomi did not answer right away because something in the way the man said her name made it clear this was not a question and not a coincidence. It was a conclusion already reached, a moment already decided before she even walked through the door, and the quiet inside the diner pressed in tighter as every eye shifted toward her, waiting, measuring, wondering what came next. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady but slower than usual, buying herself a second to understand what she had stepped into, and the man gave a small nod as if confirming a detail on a list only he could see before extending a sleek envelope toward her, not rushed, not dramatic, just precise, like everything about him. Her manager shifted behind the counter, clearing his throat but saying nothing, because whatever authority he thought he had in this space was already gone, replaced by something larger, something that did not need to raise its voice to take control. Naomi hesitated for just a fraction of a second before taking the envelope, the paper thick, expensive, heavier than it should have been for something so simple, and when she opened it, the sound seemed louder than it was, a soft tear that echoed in the stillness. Her eyes scanning the contents as confusion flickered across her face, then disbelief, then something else she could not quite name. This diner, the man said calmly, his tone respectful but firm, has been acquired as of this morning, and a ripple moved through the room. Subtle but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that everyone could feel, but no one could stop. And Naomi looked up, her brows pulling together as she tried to connect the dots that did not yet form a clear picture, because places like this did not just get acquired overnight, not without warning, not without reason. By who? She asked, the question leaving her before she could stop it, and for the first time, the man allowed a faint pause, just enough to let the answer carry weight before he spoke it. Ethan Caldwell. And the name landed differently this time. No longer just a stranger. At a table, no longer just a man she stood up for, but something else entirely, something that stretched far beyond the walls of this diner. Naomi's grip tightened slightly on the paper, her mind racing back to the night before, the quiet call, the single sentence that shifted everything, the way the officers stepped back without explanation, and suddenly it was not confusion anymore. It was realization, sharp and immediate, like a door opening too fast. Around her, whispers grew louder. Customers leaning toward each other, staff exchanging glances, her manager standing frozen as if the ground beneath him had changed ownership without his permission, which in a way, it had. What does that mean? Naomi asked, not looking at anyone else, only at the man in front of her, because somehow she already knew this was not just about a building or a business. It was about something far more personal. The man adjusted his cuff slightly, mirroring a gesture she had seen the night before, and then he answered, his voice even, unshaken. It means he would like to speak with you. And the words did not sound like an invitation. They sounded like the next step in something that had already begun. Something Naomi had unknowingly set into motion the moment she decided not to step aside. And now, standing in the center of a diner that no longer felt like hers to move freely in, she realized that whatever power she had challenged last night had not disappeared. It had simply changed direction and found its way back to her. The words settled heavier than the paper in her hands. Not an invitation, but a shift in gravity, and Naomi felt it in the way the room no longer belonged to the people inside it, but to the decision already made somewhere far beyond these walls. He would like to speak with you, the man repeated, softer this time, as if giving her space to understand what that truly meant. But Naomi did not move right away, her mind still catching up, still trying to place Ethan Caldwell not as the quiet man at booth 6, but as someone who could change ownership of a business before sunrise. Her manager finally found his voice, stepping forward with forced confidence that did not reach his eyes, asking questions about contracts, about notice, about legality. But the answers came back calm, precise, already prepared, each one closing a door he had hoped to open. And Naomi watched it happen without fully hearing the words because something else was pulling her attention forward, something quieter but stronger, the memory of Ethan's voice the night before, The way he said be careful like it was not advice but certainty. Where is he? She asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider, and the man turned slightly, gesturing toward the window where the line of black vehicles still waited outside, engines low, patient, like time itself had slowed just for this moment. He is in the car, he said, and for a second the entire diner seemed to lean toward that answer, curiosity stretching across every table, every face, every whispered assumption. Naomi felt her pulse steady instead of race, not because she was calm, but because something inside her had decided already, the same part of her that stepped forward last night without knowing what would happen next, and she handed the envelope back to the counter, not needing to read it again, not needing more proof, because the truth was already standing outside waiting for her. The bell above the door rang softly as she pushed it open, the morning air cooler now, sharper, carrying the scent of asphalt and coffee from down the street, and every step she took felt louder than it should have, measured, deliberate, as if the ground itself was aware she was crossing into something she could not step back from. The vehicles stood in perfect stillness, doors closed, windows tinted, reflecting a version of the street that looked untouched, ordinary. But Naomi knew better now. She knew that ordinary could shift in a single moment and never return. One of the rear doors opened before she reached it, not by chance but by timing, precise and controlled, and Ethan Caldwell stepped out, not rushed, not dramatic, just present, the same composed energy from the night before, but now surrounded by a context that made it impossible to ignore, his suit immaculate, his posture unchanged, his eyes finding hers immediately as if he had been watching her approach the entire time. For a brief second, neither of them spoke, the noise of the street fading into the background, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. The recognition that this was no longer a random encounter, no longer a moment between strangers, but the continuation of a choice she had made without understanding the scale of it. You came, he said simply, and Naomi let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her voice steady even as everything else shifted around her. You bought my diner, she replied, not as a question but as a statement. And Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his gaze sharpened slightly, like he had been waiting for her to say exactly that. I bought the building, he corrected calmly, and the distinction hung in the air between them, subtle but important, before he added, the diner is still yours, if you choose it to be. And in that moment Naomi understood that whatever this was, it was not about taking something from her. It was about offering something she had not asked for, something she was not sure she wanted, and yet could not ignore, because the man standing in front of her was not just powerful, he was intentional, and that made everything far more complicated than she had expected. Naomi did not answer immediately because the offer did not feel like an offer. It felt like a test, quiet but deliberate, the kind that reveals more about you than the person asking. And she studied Ethan carefully now, not just the man she had defended, but the man who could redraw the lines of her life overnight without raising his voice. Why? She asked finally, the single word carrying more weight than anything longer could. And Ethan did not rush to respond, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if he respected the question enough to consider it properly instead of dismissing it with something easy. The city moved around them, cars passing, distant conversations blending into the background, but in that moment, it felt contained, narrowed down to just the space between them, the question hanging there waiting for something real. Because you stood where others stepped back, he said at last, his tone even, not praising, not dramatic, just stating a fact as he saw it. And Naomi felt something shift again, not in the world this time but inside herself, because she had not thought of it as courage, she had thought of it as necessary, as something she could not ignore, but hearing it reflected back to her, like that made it feel different, heavier, like it mattered beyond that moment. She folded her arms slightly, grounding herself, not wanting to be pulled into something she did not fully understand. And that gives you the right to buy a building and hand it to me? She asked, her voice sharper now, not rude but firm, because power like his did not come without conditions, not in her experience, not in any story she had ever seen play out. Ethan's expression shifted just enough to show he expected that response, not offended, not surprised, just acknowledging it. It gives me the right to make a decision, he said, What you do with it is yours. And again there was that distinction, subtle but precise, separating control from choice in a way that felt intentional. Naomi glanced back toward the diner, the windows reflecting both of them now. Two versions of reality overlapping. The life she knew and the one standing in front of her offering something unfamiliar, something bigger. And she thought about the years she had spent working double shifts, counting tips, adjusting her life around limitations she never chose, and how in a single night that structure had been disrupted by one decision she made without knowing the consequences. Nothing comes free, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Ethan nodded once, not disagreeing. That is true, he replied. But not everything comes with a cost you expect. And the words lingered, not as a promise but as a possibility, one she could accept or walk away from. A breeze moved through the street, light but noticeable, carrying with it the distant scent of fresh bread from somewhere down the block, and Naomi let it settle her for a moment, let herself feel the weight of where she stood, because this was not just about a building or a job. This was about stepping into something unknown and deciding whether she trusted herself enough to handle it. She looked back at him, really looked this time, past the suit, past the quiet authority, to the man who had stood silently while she spoke for him, who had not corrected her, not stopped her, just let her choose, and that mattered more than anything he could buy. If I say no, she asked, testing the edge of the moment, and Ethan's answer came without hesitation. Then nothing changes, he said, except you will know you had the option. And for the first time since this began, Naomi felt something close to control return to her, not because the situation was simple, but because the decision was hers, fully, undeniably hers, and that realization carried more power than the cars, the suits, or the name standing in front of her. Naomi let the silence stretch just long enough to feel real, not dramatic, not forced, just honest. Because this was the kind of moment people imagined they would handle easily until it actually stood in front of them, dressed in calm confidence and quiet power, asking for a decision that could not be undone. She looked past Ethan for a second, back toward the diner windows where her reflection stood layered over the life she had built piece by piece, shift by shift, tip by tip, a life that was not glamorous, but it was hers, earned, familiar, predictable in the ways that made it safe. And now that safety felt fragile, like something she could hold on to or step beyond, but not both. If I take it, she said slowly, her voice measured as if each word needed to land exactly where she intended. It does not become yours to control later. And it was not a question this time. It was a boundary, clear and deliberate, the kind that did not bend easily, and Ethan's response came just as steady. If you take it, it becomes yours to define, he said. And there was no hesitation in it. No hidden condition in his tone, just a line drawn as cleanly as the one she had just placed between them. Naomi exhaled quietly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something more grounded, less overwhelming, because clarity had a way of doing that, of turning something impossible into something simply difficult, and difficult she could handle. A car passed behind them, the sound fading quickly, and the street seemed to return to its normal rhythm even as everything else remained suspended, waiting for her answer. She thought about the people inside, her co-workers, the regulars who came in every morning at 6:30, the smell of coffee that never quite left her clothes, the small routines that made up a life no one noticed but her, and then she thought about the envelope, the suits, the way her name had been spoken like it carried weight, like it mattered beyond the space she occupied. And something inside her shifted, not into confidence, not into certainty, but into willingness. I will not be a symbol, she said, her eyes locking onto his, steady, unflinching. And I will not be a story you tell about yourself, because she had seen that before, seen people turned into proof of someone else's generosity, and she refused to become that, no matter how large the offer standing in front of her. Ethan's gaze did not break. And for the first time there was something almost like respect moving through it, subtle but unmistakable. Then do not be, he replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because it did not try to convince her, it did not reshape her terms, it simply accepted them. Naomi nodded once, not as agreement yet, but as acknowledgement that she had been heard, and That mattered more than she expected. The air shifted again, lighter this time, less like pressure and more like possibility, and she realized that whatever this was, it was no longer about proving something to him or to anyone watching. It was about deciding what she wanted her life to look like when no one else was writing the script. She glanced back at the diner one more time, the familiar outline of it steady against the morning light, and then she turned back to Ethan, her voice calm, grounded, carrying the weight of everything she had just considered. "Then we do this my way," she said, and it was not a request, it was a declaration, one that did not need permission to exist, and in that moment the balance between them shifted, not equal in power, but equal in presence, which was something far rarer and far more dangerous than either of them had expected. The moment hung between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like something invisible had just been set into motion, and Ethan gave a small nod, not as approval but as acknowledgement, the kind that said he understood exactly what she meant without needing it explained twice. "Then we do this your way," he repeated, and there was no resistance in his voice, no attempt to reshape her terms, which somehow made the situation feel even more real, because power that does not argue is power. That does not need to. Naomi did not smile, did not celebrate, because this was not a victory, not yet, it was a decision. One that came with weight she could already feel settling on her shoulders, and she turned back toward the diner without waiting for anything else, her steps steady, grounded, as if the space she was walking into had already changed and she needed to meet it where it now stood, inside. The room shifted the second she crossed the threshold, conversation stopping mid-sentence, eyes lifting again. But this time it was different, not curiosity alone, not confusion, something closer to recognition. Like the people in that room understood that whatever had just happened outside had altered the rules inside. Her manager stepped forward quickly, words ready but uncertain, asking what was going on, what this meant, what they were supposed to do, and Naomi held up a hand, not to silence him, but to pause the panic, because rushing now would only make things smaller than they were. "We keep working," she said simply, her voice calm, clear, carrying across the room without force. And something about the way she said it settled the space, not completely, but enough to shift the energy from chaos to focus. The suits followed her in, not crowding, not interrupting, just present, observing, like they were there to support, but not to lead, and that alone changed everything. Because for the first time Naomi was not reacting to power, she was directing it. She moved behind the counter, tying her apron a little tighter, grounding herself in the familiar motions, pouring coffee, checking orders, letting routine anchor her while everything else adjusted around her, and one by one the diner returned to life, plates moving, conversations restarting, but now, with a different rhythm, one shaped by something unspoken but understood. Outside, the cars remained, silent, patient, a reminder that this was not temporary, not a moment that would fade when the shift ended, and Naomi could feel it in the way people looked at her now. Not past her, not through her, but at her, like she had stepped into a role no one had assigned, but everyone could see. She caught Ethan's reflection in the window as he remained outside for a moment longer, watching, not intruding, not directing, just observing the choice she had made and the way she carried it. And there was no smile, no obvious reaction, just a quiet stillness that suggested this was exactly what he expected, or maybe exactly what he hoped for. Naomi turned back to her work, her hands steady, her movements precise, but her mind sharper than it had ever been, because she understood now that this was only the beginning, that ownership was not the end of a story but the start of a responsibility she had not asked for but had chosen anyway. And as the morning light pushed further into the diner, filling every corner with a soft, steady glow, one thing became clear without anyone needing to say it out loud. The space had not just changed hands, it had changed direction, and the person guiding it forward was no longer invisible. By noon, the diner no longer felt like a place people passed through. It felt like a place people arrived at with intention, the air carrying a different kind of energy, not louder but sharper, as if every small detail now mattered more, because someone was finally paying attention to them, and Naomi could feel it in the rhythm of her own movements, in the way she spoke to customers, in the way her voice carried just a little further without needing to rise. Orders flowed, coffee refilled, plates cleared, but underneath it all there was a quiet awareness that something had shifted permanently, not just in ownership, but in expectation. Because when a space changes hands, it does not just change who signs the papers, it changes what is possible inside it. Her manager hovered near the register, still uncertain, still adjusting, but no longer interrupting. Because even he could sense that whatever authority he thought he held had been replaced by something steadier, something that did not come from a title but from presence. Naomi paused for a brief second between orders, her hands resting on the counter as she looked out across the room. Really looking this time. At the regular in the corner booth, who always came in at 6:30, at the young couple sharing a plate near the window, at the delivery driver checking his watch while sipping coffee. And she realized that this place had always mattered, just not to the people who had the power to shape it. Until now. Outside, the line of black vehicles had thinned, one by one disappearing into the flow of the city, leaving behind only a single car still parked across the street, quiet, unobtrusive, but present, and Naomi knew without needing to confirm that Ethan was still there, still watching, not to control, not to interfere, but to witness what she would do with what he had set in motion. She turned back to the counter, picking up a fresh pot of coffee, her movements smooth, intentional, and something about that simple act carried more weight than anything that had happened so far, because this was not about grand gestures or dramatic change. It was about consistency, about choosing every day what kind of place this would be and who it would serve. A customer approached, hesitant at first, then more certain, asking if anything was going to change, if prices would go up, if the place would become something else entirely. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. Her answer simple but firm. Only if it needs to, she said. And the man nodded, not fully understanding but trusting the clarity in her voice, because confidence, when it is real, does not require explanation. Across the street, the car door opened quietly, and Ethan stepped out one last time, not entering, not interrupting, just standing there for a moment as the sunlight hit the glass of the diner, reflecting the scene inside back at him. And for the first time there was the faintest shift. In his expression, not pride, not ownership, but something closer to recognition, like he understood that whatever he had done, whatever decision he had made, had not created something new. It had revealed something that had been there all along. Naomi did not look at him this time, not because she was ignoring him, but because she did not need to. The balance between them no longer required constant awareness, and that in itself was the final shift, the moment where power stopped being something external and became something internal, something she carried without needing permission. The bell above the door rang again as another customer walked in, the ordinary rhythm continuing, but now grounded in something deeper, something earned in a single night and proven in every moment after. And as the day moved forward, one truth settled quietly into place without announcement or applause. He had the power to change everything, but she had the power to decide what that change meant, and in the end, that was the kind of power no one could take back.